Now is the time in my project where I'm adding the sequins onto the dress. You might obviously be adding your sequins in a different way. I do discuss this in the introduction video. But this video will talk you through the option that I chose, which was to add the sequins on myself. I decided that sewing these sequins on would take a long time, so I decided to glue them straight on. I bought a selection of sequins and rhinestones, anything that would shine when the light hits Harley Quinn's dress. Here's the rough amounts and the sizes of everything that I used. If you total these up, you'll see there's at least 7,000 sequins and rhinestones on my dress. The majority of these I added to the skirt. The glue that I'm using for my sequins is E6000 Fabri-Fuse. It really creates a strong, flexible bond. To apply the rhinestones and sequins, I use a set of tweezers. To apply E6000 to fabric, you're meant to lay it flat. So I lay my mannequin on the floor to be able to do this. When gluing the sequins on, it's a good idea to start with the largest ones, scatter them around and then dot the smaller sequins around it. Then you can go in and add the rhinestones. I bought my sequins on a string. If I could go back, I would buy them loose. Removing sequins from a string thousands of times will eat up some of your project time. To remove the sequins from the string, simply pull them off one by one. The instructions say that you apply glue to both surfaces to be joined together. I dawed a really tiny bit of glue around the sequin and then a little bit onto the top. I would do a couple of tests first, as you don't want to glue and find there's glue oozing out the sides. Once the sequin is on, I give it a little tap with the tweezers. This will ensure both surfaces are pressed together. I then repeat the process with another sequin. You'll notice that I'm spacing out the sequins and applying them randomly. The aim of my design is to space these sequins out to allow the other smaller sequins in between. I go ahead and glue a smaller sequin just to show you the process. You can glue these on without rhyme or reason. It's your design and you should glue them on how you want. If you find that any glue is getting onto the nose of the tweezers, when you tap it down to ensure that the sides go together, you could always use the back of the tweezers. That will ensure that no glue will get stuck to the top. I now glue a couple of rhinestones just to show you the difference with those. I'd say the main difference is they're very hard to pick up with tweezers. There's a tool called a rhinestone picker. You might find it easier buying one of these and using that. I didn't have one at the time, but I actually bought it for my Cruella makeup when I did the lips. I had to apply rhinestones and it was much easier. This could potentially also save you time on your project. Don't put any sequins or rhinestones over a seam line. And I would avoid the very edges of the top. We're actually going to be sewing tulle on the edges of the top later. So you want to be able to sew through the fabric, and you can't do that if there's sequins or rhinestones there. You'll notice I put no sequins on the elasticated part of my top. That's because the fabric is not flat in those areas and obviously it's elasticated. What I actually did for that back part is cheat some of the sequins onto the tulle that I add later. So on the very back layer of tulle, I actually glue the sequins onto that. I just didn't want an area on the back that had no sequins. Also on the front of the top around the chest area, just be very careful where you're putting the larger sequins. As on curves, obviously they won't sit as flat. And we want both surfaces to be glued together seamlessly. I glued the sequins to the top in sections. Each section that I glued should remain undisturbed for 8 hours. This is the drying time for the glue. You're going to start thinking I'm some sort of magician with this dress. Yes, I did do a lot of these steps out of order, but I do explain this in the introduction video. I do recommend doing these steps in the sequential order that I'm giving you. When you're draping tulle, make sure you have excess fabric below the seam line. When I started draping the top, I never actually had rhyme or reason. I just sort of played about with the fabric until it sort of sat the way that I wanted. The front of the top should have 2 pieces of tulle, one on either side. They cross in the centre with the right side coming down and crossing over the left side. The tulle rows on my skirt have 8 layers, however this tulle was going against an opaque fabric, and I wanted to be able to see the sequins. So I decided to drape the tulle in a way that I'd have 4 layers of tulle in front of my base dress. I did a few tests with scrap tulle to work out opacity, and then arrive at this decision. The fabric that I'm pinning at the moment is actually folded so that there are the 4 layers. And the folded part is actually the part I'm pinning along the neckline. This makes sense as it's obviously a lot neater. My plan for the stage I was at right now was to pin tulle on both sides along the neckline and work out if I first of all had enough fabric for both sides, keeping in mind I needed excess tulle to be able to drape the top. For the right hand side of tulle, I'm planning on using the one piece of fabric to drape right around to the middle of the back. I won't do this with the left hand side of the dress as there is a zip that we need access to. Draping is a bit like art and you basically need to play about with it until you get what you want. All we can do is refer to reference photos to see if we're happy with what we've got. I treated this part of the draping process like a test. I actually drape it, take it out and re-drape it later after I've sewn down the zip. Doing this just allowed me to quickly work out how much tulle I'd actually need once I've sewn the tulle next to where the zip is. I knew when I was designing how I was going to make this dress that I wanted to have hidden seams along the neckline and down the side where the zip is. I often feel that top stitching can make a costume look a bit cheaper. Like if you imagine this dress with some top stitching along the neckline, it wouldn't quite give the same effect. My preferred way of doing a hidden stitch is to hand sew, and the stitch that I use is called a slip stitch. Before starting this stitch, I would create a little knot at the end of your thread. Then I would start this stitch in an inconspicuous place. In this case, the best place would be behind the neckline on the base dress. The concept of a hidden stitch is that you've got two pieces of fabric. You create tiny little stitches just catching the edge of the fabric. You then cross over to the other side and catch the edge of that fabric and do tiny little stitches. The smaller these stitches are, the less noticeable the thread's going to be. Then you can move over to the first piece of fabric and repeat the process again, and so on until you get to the end. Another important thing with this stitch is that obviously we've got tulle here. I really don't want to catch the very top layer of tulle. If I was to sew right through the tulle, then you would see the threads on the top, and it kind of defeats the point of not doing the top stitching. The aim of this stitch really is to not be able to see these stitches. We're going to use the slip stitch again to neaten the seam down the zip. I ensured when I did my test that I left an excess amount of tulle at this point. I want to ensure that I have roughly an inch of tulle that I can fold under. If you have any excess, then just cut it off very carefully. You can then go ahead and fold the raw edges of the tulle underneath so we can't see them. Now you can pin the tulle in place. We're using the slip stitch again, although this can be a bit trickier. We want to sew the tulle as close to the zip as possible, but without obstructing the zip. This might take a couple of attempts to get used to. As before, you make a tiny stitch on one side of the fabric. You then cross over to the other fabric and make a tiny stitch there. Continue this up the length of the seam. It could be the case for your dress that you don't even have a zip. You might have the fastening at the back like in the film. But if you do have a zip on your dress, this will explain how to hide the seam. I have this third panel that goes from the back of the zip to the back of the top. This one is quite easy to drape as it's just quite flat. And then I just use the slip stitch in the same way to secure it. When I'm finished, this is what the top looks like with the threads all hidden. At this stage, I go back and re-drape my top. I drape the left hand side of the tulle first. This is because it goes underneath the right hand side of the tulle. All my other sewing is secure, so this is the last step until I sew the top to the skirt. So I start to bring sections over and I secure them with round-headed pins. I know if I'm not happy with any of this, I can just take the pins out and change it. Once you're happy with the ruching on the left-hand side of the top, you really want to secure this in place before you drape the other side. So what we can do is create a temporary stitch. We want to unpick this thread later, and it is much easier if it's a different colour. That way there's no way you can unpick the wrong thread. It's also easier to see where you've sewn so you don't miss out any of the ruching. Do a straight stitch through all the ruching to catch all the gathers that you've made. The stitches can be any length you want. The main aim is to catch the edges of all the gathers that you have made, and therefore secure them in place. One thing I want to note about this drape is that when I finished the whole entire dress, I had to go back and fix it. There was slightly too much fabric in the drape, so I'd recommend really watching that when you're sewing this. You want this tulle to sit taut against you. You don't want it to look baggy, which is what happened with mine's until I fixed it. When draping the tulle, I try to have most of the ruching near the centre. I really want to be aware of the silhouette of the dress, so I pin that side out the way. And I want the tulle on the side of my waist to sit flat. That way I think it'll look more flattering. Once you're happy with the ruching, secure it in place with a different coloured thread. The way I've draped the back is quite flat. It crosses over in the middle. But I still add a temporary straight stitch to keep it in place. Now you can see what my top looks like with all the temporary thread in place. Next, I take the top to my sewing machine. I permanently secure this ruching with a straight stitch. And once I've done that, I can unpick all the blue thread. This is now what my top looks like, and I can go ahead and finish the skirt. My skirt is still missing row 1, so I go ahead and pin it close to the top of the skirt. I then stitch this row in exactly the same way as the other rows. I decided to sew this on before connecting the top to the skirt. I just felt that if I had to redo anything, at least this was secure, and I wouldn't have to do this again. Now we can finally sew the top to the skirt. I took quite a while pinning these together. It's a very important seam and I didn't want anything to go wrong. To stop the tulle sliding about, I take the magazine paper and place it underneath. I can then start sewing. I do a back stitch and then continue sewing the whole of the seam. I actually decide to go over this sewing with a zigzag stitch. The reason I did that is that this fabric seems to fray quite a bit, and zigzag stitches tend to stop it fraying so much. So just inside the seam I add the zigzag stitch. I also had to use fray stop, which is not ideal, but it was my only solution at the time. Once my dress is out the machine, I remove all of the magazine paper. And voila, we have a tulle dress. However, the dress is nowhere near finished. You can now watch tutorial 4, where I completely shape the dress and add texture.